can get started. So the theme of our panel this week is entitled Environmental Justice in North America. So we have three experts in the field from three different disciplines. So you guys will be getting three approaches to this topic. We have a professor in history, one in languages and culture, and then a professor in the School of Law, which is very exciting. And so just like last week, I'll ask our three panelists if you could briefly introduce yourself, your expertise, your discipline before launching into your lecture. Without further ado, we'll start with Professor Ford.
Well, I'll start so Dr. Ford can figure out how to do that because Zoom is always changing all the buttons on us all the time. I'm Dr. Amanda Petersen. I'm the professor who is in language, cultures, and literatures. I think you have another professor from our department, including Dr. Smith. Actually, there are three of us, I think, that are talking about this topic. I am a professor of Spanish and Latin American studies, and my specialty is around Latin American studies, Mexico and border studies. And what that means is it might sound like I'm a historian like Dr. Ford, but I study cultural production, literature, film, poetry, art, and all sorts of cultural productions that have to do, there you go, Dr. Ford, that have to do with Mexico border. And I particularly focus generally on gender studies. And you'll hear a little bit about this, but I do ghost studies and things that are haunted. So I will talk to you about that. I'll pass over back to well, I guess we can go to Dr. Silva-Send, can introduce herself, and then we can go to Dr. Ford and he can take over from there.
Actually, let Matt go first, Dr. Ford, because I do have a little slide that explains a little bit my background, which explains why I do what I do. So if that's okay, back to you, Dr. Ford.
Sure. That sounds great. Thank you all so much. So my name is Professor Ford. I do not have a doctorate, so I just want to correct folks. I have an MFA in creative writing, so I kind of got into history in a really weird kind of way. Um, but I do plan on getting my PhD in a couple of years now that I'm ready for that. But just to let everyone know, I am qualified to teach this class. So a little bit of my background. So I come from an anthropological background. I study anthropology, cultural anthropology at Vassar College as an undergrad, and then got my MFA or Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at University of California, San Diego, so across town. And in both my bachelor's and master's, I specialized in African American and then eventually African diasporic history. And then that eventually led into looking at the history of African Americans and how we engage with the indigenous. And then I ended up teaching US history at USD, and now I am deep into indigenous history and resistance. So I have a really wayward path. But I'm really happy to be here. So just a couple of other quick things about me before I truly dive in. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, the greatest city in the world, the Motor City, and lived in Chicago for a couple of years. And my primary research right now, I'm finishing up a novel about the history of Black American music, which you can, if you happen to be taking my class on Beyonce this fall, I'll be using a lot of my research in that class. So it'll be a lot of fun. I'll also be teaching this class. This lecture is kind of an excerpt from my larger class, U.S. History to 1877, which is just intro history in which we dig into a lot of Indigenous and African American history. So consider this like a really bite-sized piece of what you will get in one of my classes. So yeah, let's dive right in. All right, so environmental colonialism in the US, history, policy, and indigenous resistance. I know we have about 20 minutes, so I'm going to just periodically look at my clock. Okay, about 10:30. Okay, cool. All right, so let's dive right in. Okay. So some of our guiding questions for today will be one, how has environmental colonialism impacted indigenous cultural traditions from the dawn of colonialism to now? Two, what policies and practices have directly impacted Indigenous cultural life, such as spirituality, including religious rites and ceremonies to gathering spaces. I'll add this in here. Like Dr. Petersen, I also deeply study the spooky. So a major part of my work in graduate school was studying ancestry and how we as African diasporic folks continue our indigenous spiritual traditions from the motherland over into the US and throughout the Americas. So yes to the spooky, yes to ghosts. And then lastly, how have indigenous people resisted the pillaging of their living environments from the 1607 Jamestown, Virginia settlement to the Trail of Tears to Standing Rock? So yeah, we'll dive into a couple of these incidents in history. So kind of consider this the history of what we will eventually study together in our section on Wednesday. So this is kind of a launching pad for you. I also want to guide us through some through what I call a guiding philosophy, and what I'm calling stewardship over ownership. So, we are a Catholic school, so whether you identify as Christian or not, I believe that there are some useful things from a religious perspective that can help us in to understand these issues. So, one in Genesis 2:15, the verse goes, quote, "The Lord God took the man or person and put him or them in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." And then in Psalm 24:1, it goes, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." I want to pause here and just say that I personally define the Lord or God as what the Buddhists call the great mystery, or as the indigenous call Mother Earth, or just responding to God more as an energy or as an entity and less as an old white man with a beard and like a staff in the sky. I don't know that man. I've never met him. I don't think I want to meet him. So this is where I'm coming from, just to let you know. And so I believe that we are stewards of the land. We are not owners of land. And then in one of my favorite books, which I taught last year's HUMC course in AI, we used this as our kind of guiding text, Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. The protagonist, Lauren Oya Olamina, says, or she rather devised this religion called Earthseed. Earthseed is, oops, Earthseed is a belief system that emphasizes the inevitability of change and the importance of shaping one's destiny through proactive engagement with the world. It represents a philosophy centered on change, adaptability, and taking responsibility for one's actions and the environment. So, Parable of the Sower will probably come back up again in our Wednesday class. And then lastly, we'll also look at what the indigenous communities themselves have to say, particularly the Muskogees or the Creeks, the Seminoles, and others. And they had three branches of government, which I like to point out in my larger class. So one of civil administration. So what we're all used to is just typical governance. Two, military, so protection from outside forces. Then three, the sacred, something that we often don't really think about. So they will often have a spiritual leader on the councils whose job would literally be to commune with the divine and to bring the divine's request, their things that the divine wanted us to do as humans, for us to actualize that on the earth. And so a way that they will often represent that tradition is by keeping a sacred fire burning in their camps. And they would also, and that is to symbolize a human relationship with the spirit beings, as well as having that council person on in their government. Okay, so let's go into some pre-colonial indigenous agricultural history. So this will be really quick. I won't even read all of this. So 12,000 years ago was the development of agriculture, humans starting to put agriculture together, and we learn how to grow things out of the earth, which led to the domestication of plants in 7 locales. Specifically, we're looking at the Valley of Mexico in Central America, or what we call Mesoamerica. We'll look at some maps in a little bit too, so you can see exactly what and where we're talking about, as well as South Central Andes in South America and Eastern North America. I like to talk about corn. There's this great book called the Indigenous History of the United States, um, which is one of the core texts for my class. And she spends a whole chapter talking about corn, just for us to understand agriculture from the very beginning. And so corn dates back 10,000 years and required human attention and water, which of course required then an irrigation system, a complex irrigation system that existed long before Europeans knew of the Americas. I mention this because often in our US history classes prior to college, we assume, or rather, we just don't dig into that history enough. So we just assume that, oh, and the indigenous people, they were kind of just la 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 doing whatever, on their land until boom, the British comes along and then wow, now we have civilization. Quite the opposite. The indigenous were doing their own thing long before the Europeans came along and had very complex systems and ways of living. So for example, in 1669, a traveler in French North America, or what we'll look at in a couple of minutes as the southeastern United States, found 6 square miles of corn surrounding each Iroquois village. And then in the 1680s, in that same region, if someone could admit the folks, I'm just going to ignore that. It keeps popping up on my screen. Sorry. Um, in the 1680s, the governor of New France destroyed 42,000 tons of corn. And then, of course, the indigenous had their own systems of medical health and herbal medicine and carried on mostly vegetarian diet. So this is all just to signal to you what agriculture and the environment looked like prior to colonial contact. Right, here's a quick quote from one of those spiritual leaders on those councils that I mentioned a few minutes ago, Oren Lyons, who was the faith keeper of the Turtle Clan and a member of the Onondaga Council of Chiefs. So he said, quote, "The first principle is peace." So, of course, going back to civilization. The second principle is equity and justice for the people. And third, the power of the good minds, of the collective powers to be of one mind, unity, and health. All of these were involved in the basic principles. In the process of discussion, putting aside warfare as a method of reaching decisions, and now using intellect. So using the mind, and again, connecting the mind back to the divine is the way that the indigenous would commune. Right, I'll blow through this also pretty quickly. I want to get to the primary issues, but again, just to give you a little bit more history. So once colonial contact happened in what we now call the Americas. So first acknowledging Spanish rule, Emperor Montezuma, the ninth emperor of the Aztec Empire from 1503, was overthrown by the Spanish. And then, of course, there's, you may remember this from your high school or maybe even middle school history classes, Hernan Cortez's genocide over the Aztec Empire from 1519 to 1521 in their search for gold. So we're starting to understand that previously the indigenous had all of these amazing traditions. And also, I want to pause for a second and say that I don't want to mythologize a perfect community and like, oh, everyone was perfect and wonderful and before colonial contact. These are all still humans. So what I get into in my class is all the wars that led up to the Aztec Empire. We'll come back to that this fall. But yes, so just to acknowledge that the preoccupation with the indigenous was stewardship over the land. And once the Europeans came over, it suddenly became about money and land ownership and gold rather than taking care of the environment and having a direct connection with the divine. And then, of course, we all know about 1607, the British encroachment on what we call modern day Virginia, and the story of Pocahontas, whose name was actually Matawaka. So when the 104 Englishmen originally arrived, they suffered from a lack of food, bad soil, bad water, mosquitoes, and self-contaminated water. I do say in class that the British would go to the bathroom in their own water and then drink it. and cook with it, et cetera, et cetera. So they just didn't know what they were doing. They were in a whole new land. Of course, these were mostly nobles, so they did not have any frame of reference on how to actually take care of land. This is also important in environmental justice. Do you know what you're doing on the land? Can you actually take care of it? Can you be a good steward of the land? And the British sent Captain Christopher Newport and the Mini Johns, because apparently the British were not very creative in their naming. um, and long story short, King Wahausanaka would send food to the British, but they eventually captured his daughter Matawaka, who they sent off to Britain into a forced marriage with John Rolfe, and she later died. And sorry, that should say 1613, not 1630. But anyway, so just to give you some overview of history of where we're coming from and a little bit of misinfo to correct some misinformation about Pocahontas. We do watch Pocahontas in my class too, so we'll do a deeper dive into that. All right. So let's get into the larger issues. We're going to look at three primary issues or three pieces of policy that impacted Indigenous life over the last throughout American history, and then we'll go into that article that I assigned from the Washington Post. So many of us know about the Trail of Tears, right? The Indian Removal Act from 1830. So this was signed into law May 28th of 1830 by President Andrew Jackson. Ooh, oh, I heard someone coming in. Just make sure that you mute yourself if you get a chance. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Okay. So this act was signed into law on May 28th, 1830 by President Andrew Jackson, who this law initially started out as a negotiation with the Native American tribes to eventually take over their ancestral lands and to send them west of the Mississippi. But this negotiation was actually a forced displacement. We'll look at a quote in a moment. So this was a forced displacement that we now call the Trail of Tears, which lasted from 1830 into 1850. Most of the indigenous traveled by foot over thousands of miles to the other side of the country. And according to the U.S. National Park Service, with those podcasts that I sent you guys, I want you guys to listen to some of those. The National Park Service says that over 10,000 died during the Trail of Tears in that 20-year period. The Trail of Tears primarily impacted the Cherokee, but also impacted the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, and the Seminole. This also led to what we now call the reservation era, but I have this in parentheses. It's still ongoing today. I don't really like to call it an era because we're still dealing with reservational issues today. So reservations are legally defined portions of land allocated to federally recognized tribes. Emphasis on federally recognized. There are still a lot of communities that are still battling to get recognized today, which of course is ridiculous because why do we have to be recognized by people who weren't here in the first place? And this was all to establish and to remove and to then Americanize indigenous communities. One quick court case that I want to point to give you an idea of how this impacted indigenous communities was the Ex Parte Crow Dog policy in 1883, in which Crow Dog, a chief of the Brule band of the Lakota Sioux, had murdered a political rival, Spotted Tail, who was another leader, another political leader sharing reservational land. And so the Supreme Court said that this is a tribal, not a federal matter, and they left it to the indigenous to deal with on their own. Congress disagreed and later passed the Major Crimes Act of 1885, which then gave the federal government, the United States, criminal jurisdiction over Indian country. This is according to the Howard University School of Law. Here is a quick quote. I'm going to skip down to the bottom section. So this is Andrew Jackson's speech, which was adapted into the act. I'm going to start here in paragraph 3. Oop. What good man would prefer a country covered with forest and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studied with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. So in the previous two paragraphs, Andrew Jackson is basically just going into what I had just said previously, why we have the Indian Removal Act, why this was happening to remove the indigenous from their land and to then Americanize them. But I wanted to read this last quote here to also give you an idea of how the federal government was thinking about the indigenous and how they were ultimately thinking about humanity. So kind of trying to coerce the indigenous and saying, well, wouldn't you rather move over to this large swath of land if you don't want to be a part of our community? And obviously, once they had even gotten to that large swath of land, things weren't so great over there either. And then quickly here is just a map of where the indigenous came from. So the Seminole, if you're following my cursor, the Seminole in Florida and the creek above them, the Choctaw to the west, the Chickasaw, and then primarily the Cherokee. Then here is the Powhatan, which was the land. It was actually called the land, not the people were called Powhatan, but of course the British messed that up. And so the land, the Powhatan land was the land that was originally ruled by King Wahusanaca in Virginia. All right, so let's move along. This one will be a little bit quicker, but I want to make sure that we're also understanding not just how the U.S. government infringed upon the rights and the land of the indigenous, but also how the Spanish and then the European Catholic Church also infringed on those rights. So during this same century in during the same era in 1833, the Mexican Secularization Act was put into law and was officially called the Decree for the Secularization of the Missions of California. So I know that many of us have, of course, heard of missions, we've heard of ranches, and so here's a little bit of a brief history about that. So this law was passed by the Mexican government to transfer ownership of California's mission lands, so the Spanish mission lands, from the Franciscan Order of the Catholic Church to the Mexican government. This law was aimed to dismantle the mission system and to redistribute the land primarily to Mexican citizens and settlers. However, much of this land was acquired by wealthy Californios or Mexican Californians, which then led to the establishment of large ranchos or ranches and further exploitation of indigenous communities. So when you hear about these cities called Rancho Bernardo or Rancho this, Rancho that, that is where this comes from, the Rancho era, which lasted through the 1840s, which was a period of a wave of land grants, which led to the loss of indigenous land and the decline of missions. So really, this was supposed to reclaim that land and ended up just being another instance of capitalism and wealthy people being able to buy up this land, which is how we got California today and why California is so egregiously expensive. We'll go more into that history in my class. I don't know if he's teaching it this year, but the former chair of the history department, Michael Gonzalez, also teaches an incredible class on the history of, I think it's the history of California or it's the history of Mexico, one or the other. But he goes into that history of California and Mexico because California used to be Mexico. So consider taking his class. Then really quickly, here's a map that he actually uses in his class so that you can see the Kumeyaay lands. We currently in San Diego are living on Kumeyaay land, and you can see where that is. And then here's the border, or rather the border crossed California. We do not cross the border. All right, last but not least, I hope it's okay if I take a couple of extra minutes since we're going until 12, but I'll wrap this up really quickly. So while you guys were in, this was almost a decade ago. So you guys may have been in like a middle school. So I don't know if you guys, like maybe you have heard about this issue, like when it was on the news. But just to give you some more information, now that you're older and you're in college and you can now study it. So the Standing Rock protest of 2016 was a series of demonstrations beginning in early 2016, which was against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, or what we call DAPL, near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. This action raised concerns about the pipeline's potential to contaminate their water supply in the Missouri River, in which would also cross through sacred sites and ancestral lands. So again, let's go back to the beginning of this lecture where we talked about how important divine knowledge and ancestral wisdom and a direct connection between human and the divine is really, really critical to Indigenous life. And so if those sites and those lands are then crossed, even though we are stewards of this land, not owners, the Indigenous believe that the spirits still inhabit the land. And so this is not only an environmental disruption, but also a spiritual disruption. And so the protest began with water protector camps, so folks protecting the water near the pipeline construction site at Lake Oahe, and which attracted thousands, including other Indigenous communities in the area. So again, Indigenous solidarity, and gained significant media attention, which led to the hashtag #NoDapple. I remember when I was in college, this was my junior year of college. We also had #NoDapple protest on campus, and we were engaged with the media, engaged with other organizers across the country. Um, and so these protests were obviously met with resistance from law enforcement, who used water cannons, tear gas, and rubber bullets to disperse the crowd. The pipeline was eventually completed a year later in April 2017, and began operating in the next month. So ultimately, I wouldn't say that these actions were in vain, but they ultimately, the U.S. did what they wanted to do anyway. And so but it still wonderfully, however bittersweetly, still raised concerns of present day Indigenous environmental justice and ongoing friction with the federal government assumed to be resolved. I have this last part here because even I, as an ignorant junior in college, wasn't fully aware of ongoing Indigenous issues with the environment. Obviously, we're all talking about climate change, but how that directly impacts Indigenous communities and what is still happening to their land, or rather the land that they steward, not own. What is continuing to happen to that, and how can we still be, how can we engage with Indigenous communities and justice today, and not just assume that, oh, well, all the Indigenous are dead, or they're all pushed off to these reservations, they have their casinos, they're happy. Not the case at all. We'll dig into more of that in my class as well. All right, so to end us off here today, I won't go into the article. I want to save the article for our discussion on Wednesday. I just wanted to give you a not super comprehensive, but some detailed history of where we've gone and where we're going in terms of policy. But I also want to point you to the fact that Indigenous folks are still doing their actions today. And so we'll dive into that article on Wednesday. So if you guys haven't read it, please, please, please read it. We're pretty much going to spend the entire class talking. I really won't spend almost any time lecturing. The whole class will be for discussion. And if you have a chance, I want you to take the opportunity to listen to at least one of those podcasts. So we will open up the class with what I call a do now assignment. This is, if you ever take a class with me, this is what I do in all of my classes. It is a 5 to 10 minute introductory writing assignment. I play music in the background. There's a writing prompt of 1 to 3 short questions just to get you thinking, and then we dive right into the rest of class. So please come prepared, having read the article, and having, if you have time, listen to at least one of those podcasts, and we'll open up class and dive right in on Wednesday. So thank you all so much for your time, and can't wait to talk with you guys soon.
Thank you so much, Professor Ford. We're going to move right along to our next speaker. And again, save your questions and comments for the very end for the Q&A. So this brings us to Professor Petersen.
Okay, so today I think I'm talking about a couple different things, but I'm mostly talking kind of about landscape. And you're going to see that there's a little bit of a personal narrative in here, and I can tell you a little bit why, and I think you'll understand a bit why I'm thinking a bit of some of my personal relationships to things that I have studied for a couple of decades. I have been at USD for 17 years, so I've been here a long time. And I am so blessed to be a border study scholars who we're literally 25 miles from the border. And so that is such a interesting place to have been. And so now you'll see that I'm studying just a little bit some of the space that I come from, which is a little bit different than. So what some of the questions that I'm asking is, what is a landscape? I am from Kansas. I grew up in Texas. I grew up kind of all my childhood in Texas and San Antonio, that in some imagination would be really similar to San Diego, but it's really not at all. It's very, very different in how it interacts with its relationship to the border, with its relationship with being a former part of Mexico. But one of the things that's really iconic about Kansas, and I am strangely sometimes a little bit of a Kansas advocate now, because I actually kind of like going back for a week at a time, so just a week at a time. But one of the things that's really iconic about flying into Kansas is this is very, like, I could have taken this from my cell phone. This is from Getty Images because it's bigger, but you can see how the land is divided up into squares, into circles, and it's very, very organized. One of the things you can't see is usually along these lines, there's trees. You can kind of see in some parts as it might be like river and landscaped, but it is very square. Now, and you can put this in the chat as well. I will answer, I'm going to ask you a few questions that you can actually answer in chat, and I will interact with you. I will not, I won't always see all of your answers, but I will be checking. But just, as a question of curiosity, is this how landscape kind of shows up in nature? It's, a rhetorical question in lots of ways, because no, right? It doesn't. Yeah, thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, everybody. This is not how it shows up, right? You can tell how micromanaged this is, and how you can imagine the kind of effort that it took to make these squares, especially when we're talking about, this is a legacy of histories that are generations old, and mostly are coming from the 1800s when this was happening. But it is kind of a fascinating sort of thing. And I think people who haven't driven through there might not notice it because it's kind of subtle. But one of the things that I have some friends that are about to move to kind of the plains of Texas. And so I've been trying to explain to them that they can't understand how flat possibly can be. And so I was taking pictures of them last month when I was at home to visit my parents. They would say, "Oh, that looks pretty flat." And I'm like, "No, no, no, that's not flat yet. This is flat." So this is one of my examples of flat on the left, on the image. And you can see that it's very flat. You can kind of see almost the horizon, and you can see a straight line of trees. And this picture that's taken from just a local press of these trees, you can see how there's trees that line up. One of the legacies of this land, and it's Kansas, it's Nebraska, it's lots and lots of areas, but in particular, and Ella, this is Ella, so she sometimes needs to be held while I'm talking on this on Zoom. So, so hello. One of the things that's a legacy of the land is the violence that was done to it. And it had great, great impact. And my dad is, he's kind of a history buff. And so I come from the legacy of my dad really talking about this history. And part of it is because we have, I knew my great grandmother, I knew my grandpa, and he was a kid who got asthma during the Dust Bowl. And my grandmother has a diary that is in my possession that she talks about how she would gather all the water from the well and wet all the towels and put them around all of the windows that weren't really windows. They were they were like a thick paper that were waxed to try and keep as much dust out as possible to try and save her kids, because she was really worried about them. So one of the things that I have been doing in my last few years, because I have been a little bit more of an administrator and a little less of a professor, has been reading specifically about what are these histories and how do they play into a sense of a greater colonial narrative, and kind of into how I have shaped and how I was interested in becoming a Latin Americanist and how in studying Mexico. So one of the greatest books, or the most important books about the Dust Bowl, is this book called The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. And it's caused, the people who survived the Dust Bowl, the Great American Dust Bowl. And I grew up hearing these stories about, people saying, and in history class, they would say, "Oh yeah, it was really terrible." And when I read this book, I had no idea of the scope of the horror and disaster that we caused by migration and violently controlling the land in the way that we did. And for the record, there were lots of people, lots of different groups who weren't really excited about all the heavy farming that happened. There were lots of ranchers, and but sometimes ranched peacefully with Indigenous groups. Sometimes they were not. But there was lots of debate about what was going on with the land. And even sometimes in the smallest little papers, there'll be these stories of in 1925. So the Dust Bowl starts in the 1930s, basically, and it's kind of happening for almost an entire decade, that people are saying, we're really worried about the land. And there would be people from native tribes that lived nearby that would say, our ancestors worked this land in this way. We took care of the land in this way. And we didn't have these dust storms because we had natural grasses that kept the land down. And there were lots of people, lots of folks that kind of surprise you, the level of debate that are happening in these small town papers in Oklahoma, for example, that are talking about their concern about how the land is being farmed and treated. So the realities of this disaster are something that it was completely unfathomable to me, even as someone who grew up with kind of this legacy of my grandparents and great grandparents told me about it. And on both sides, my grandparents were in Oklahoma during this time. And he documents that the dust was so bad that you couldn't find the roads, that people would be adrift in dust, kind of almost as if it were a snowdrift, that cattle and livestock would die. And when they cut them open, it was because they had swallowed and inhaled so much dust. The dust, the land that was being blown apart there were storms in New York City. There were storms all the way across the country. It impacted much more than just this kind of like the Bible Belt or the grain belt or whatever we want to call it. And it was so shocking to me to read that, because it wasn't per se that many years that the land was being taken up. And for the record, I'm not going to talk super in depth about homesteading and land grabs and all of those kind of things, but the federal government was very, very much implicit in selling this land as traditional farming land, right? And Professor Silvia-Send is going to talk about water, and the water is very, very crucial in this kind of moment, because it is talking about land that was meant to be it's much more dry grassland than farm. So not the Russian wheat that was cultivated, and corn grows fairly well in those areas too. But now the way that they typically farm is a little bit more of a rotation, so it is less depleting of the land. So I wanted to start out by that. And kind of talk about how I think about landscapes in that way. And what I want to do, and I think this is going to work if I go to this. So tell me if this does not follow me. Can you see this? Did it move? Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. So this goes super, super fast. But what I want you to notice, and it goes through a couple different times, is how rapidly all of these borders change. And actually, this is one of my favorite ones because it kind of loops around really fast and it's kind of dizzying in some ways. And I tried to slow it down a little bit, but I decided that I kind of like the fast, because we're not really going to take a map quiz here. But we are looking at how all of this changes. And I'm particularly interested in this area, in the Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, all of this area. Incidentally, I have never moved outside of this corridor in my life. So I've always been in this kind of southwestern land and territory. But yeah, is there anything in that surprised you? Or is there any like, oh, I didn't know that, for example, and this map is right here is a little less, so there's a part of Oklahoma that's part of the Mexican secession that's taken. Texas takes part of it, but there's a part up here in Oklahoma that is that you can't quite see, but that is part of Mexico before Mexico's secession. But I'll go back to my slides, and you can put in the chat, is there anything that surprised you about this map? Because I can say that coming from Kansas, I didn't realize, for example, that the southern part of Kansas was part of, yeah, there is a large territory in northwestern US. It's massive, right? I think if you're from the East Coast, yeah, the territory belonging to Mexico went from like this to this in like 2 seconds. Uh-huh. Texas was even bigger. You know, we know that Texas is big. Thanks for those sharings. And I'll share the links. They rapidly shifted, right? Because our notions of borders and right now are very fixed. We think that they are just absolute, that they've never changed, that they've never shifted. And things like, and we'll talk about this in different areas, but like for example, this border, that southern border of Texas is a river. Rivers change. Rivers change a lot, in fact, over history. So if on maps, when you do kind of map studies, which can be really fascinating, that's one of the things that they study. They say, oh yeah, we say this mountain top or this river is exactly X, Y, and Z in this line. But we know now with the technology that we have around maps is that it shifts dramatically. So this is another one, and I won't show you, I will share this video with you, and we can talk about it in my 2 discussions that I'll have on Tuesday, tomorrow. But it's also, this is from Business Insider, and it has a similar kind of progression. So there's a lot of unorganized territories, and I think, Isha, that's a really good point, because for example, if we go back to this one right here, do you know when this land became, that's Oklahoma, that says Indian Territory now? Do you know how late it was when it actually became a state? Anybody? Super late. 1907. 1907. California becomes a state in 1848. There's reasons for that, but it's 1907. It's super, super late. So there's so many unorganized territories. And so then we come to this picture, and you'll see some of my art in here. And this is a picture of kind of, or like an artistic representation of what we see when we cross the border. And we have this very like clear boundary of the United States. And it gives this very absolute, it's a monument. Like if you stand right here, you're in the US. If you stand right here, you're in Mexico, or vice versa. And the reality is that there's a lot of kind of liminal or boundaryless land in that space, that even with our very protected and militarized borders right now is more kind of movable and shifting than we think. So this is also a little bit interactive. So I wanted to show you just a couple pictures of border art from 2017. And this was a particular moment in history that we're not going to talk about right now. But I wanted to show you a couple notions of kind of border as art. So what do you see here? This is in the Mexicali-Calexico border. What do you see? And you can unmute if you wanted to say something. It's kind of an interesting image. See a kid? Is there anything that you notice about the kid that you're like, huh, kind of strange? Is there anything strange about the scale? Massive hands. Massive hands. Do they look like kids' hands? The child is curious and huge. Massive. Yeah, and only black and white. Looking to the other side of the continent. And I think you probably are noticing, yeah, it's unclear which side they're on. There does look like some houses in the background looking down. Great observations, especially on the scale. I think the scale is very unsettling on purpose. And I think some other contrasts that are unsettling are like that wall seems very harsh and militarized, and then militarized with a border patrol. And the soldier is tiny in comparison to him, right? And the kid looks pretty playful. Like he doesn't look like he's about to have a little, meltdown or anything. He's like, oh, what's going on? So here's another one. And this one is another very kind of iconic. The 2 biggest border crossings in Mexico and US are Tijuana, the Tijuana San Isidro one, and then the Juarez El Paso. What do you see here? Black and white again. Eyes on each side. Eyes split by a wall. Again, like the aerial, the large scale. Great. And then there's lots of people on both sides. So it seems like there's some collaboration, which seems kind of interesting. People maybe like picnicking or like hanging out. Yeah, socializing. Lots of people on both sides. And they're not on top of it. I think it's a good observation that they're probably eating. I'll share articles from both of these that talk about both of these pieces that because I think they're fascinating, and the story around this artist is really interesting. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he's from Mexicali as well and lives in the Tijuana area, or used to last time I looked at him. Notice, I think on both of these, the humanity is very stark, right? And very touching. These eyes are like hyper real. There's a reflection in them. It looks like there's people in the reflection. We're not sure what the reflection is, but it looks like very alive, very almost compassionate because life and human is reflected in the eyes. The scale again is very disconcerting, right? Because we see people as kind of little like ants and doing something social, but then we have these massive eyes that are divided by something that is very stark and militarized. So thanks for participating with me a little bit on this. And so one of the things that I think about often is how we look at border as landscape and how we are reading kind of landscape in ways that show us histories, that show us power dynamics, and show us different ways that land has been used. So for example, this is a picture that's fairly old that is part of the estuary that used to be, it's a park that kind of goes up to International Friendship Park that has recycled tires that are used as stairs. And there's a lot of fascinating studies about this particular space and how it has been used and reappropriated, even as it has been a site of waste from both sides of the country, of both sides of the border, but also, as you see, as a very human and lived space with these tires, used as actually making the land more usable and being able to be traversed by people and humans, presumably to interact. There are two other, and I think Eliza, or Dr. Smith, if you could tell me time-wise how I am, I'll pick my samples based on that.
I think you're good with time. We have I think
Okay.
for everybody.
Because there's three. So the next thing that I wanted to show is kind of border as landscape. This is another piece of my art that you saw kind of a bit of. And you can see how this was done in 2021 and 2022. And in 2022, we in the fall, there were a lot of political refugees from the Ukraine coming into the US and coming in through Tijuana. And it was striking to me as a border studies scholar who has watched many, many waves of migrants come towards Tijuana, how different the reception was of Ukrainian refugees, political refugees. And so I was really thinking about how there is this artificial land, and in this like screenshot from Google Maps, you see this like stark, like line. But when you're really looking at the landscape and the textures of the surface, you see the flow. And even with the waters, there might be currents that change and move, but there is no line that really can separate neighbors and people. Some of the walls that we have created have made it more difficult for animals to cross and people to cross and more dangerous for all of those things. But I was really thinking about how there is such a difference in solidarity of migrant movement, which also very much relates to kind of my family's history and how we talk about, for example, the Dust Bowl. There are certain populations that migrated into land who were invited to take over lands and to take it from other people who had also been given that land, that were invited, and they were allowed and okay to do that. And there were many people who were not allowed or welcome to take those lands. And so that was one of the reflections that I was doing when I was working on this art. And this is digital drawing. And here's a detail of that. And my goal was to really show interactions and movement and flow, and how landscapes, even though in our minds and in our political discourse, we try to divide landscapes as political absolutes or as lined absolutes, but that they're not in the way that we try to imagine them. And this I just threw in because Professor Ford had told us about kind of corn, and corn is also grown very much in the Midwest, but also very important and key to Mexico and all of the Mesoamerican indigenous cultures. And this is from art in Mexico around corn, and also reminds me of one of the anecdotes that my great grandmother had of a neighbor woman who was married to a white man who taught, who sought the protection of my great grandmother's family because she was alone with her child. And so they shared a household or land because there were people there were indigenous activists trying to resist land takeover. And this Indian woman asked them to live on her land to help protect, and taught her how to mill corn by hand. And it is a really interesting story that she just kind of happened to include in her little narratives that I think about when I think about these kind of interacts. So I just want to, I can't be, I would be remiss if I didn't just mention a few little things that are kind of like about border and desert and landscapes. And when we talk about the desert and to talk about the border, we're always talking about a land that is not defined, even though in the popular discourse, we like to define it as a line. So there are no roads, no signposts to orient the wonder, to fix points of movement. To be in the desert, which is often the borderland, is really liminal. It's to be in between. And so one of the questions that that a colleague who studies Southwestern studies and is an author asks is, when we're talking about like a desert border landscape, how do we talk about it as not as a negative absence? Sorry, my transitions are both annoyingly fast and slow at the same time. How do we talk about a desert not as a negative or a border as an absence, but as something that exists, but also that is imagining? So it's not something that we always are defining, but it's also something that's imagined. And when we're talking about people, border narratives and border cultural expression, we're often talking about a border discourse that is not about cutting things off, separating, but about imagining what could be possible and about what is impossible in a lot of what we talk about in our popular discourse. So I'm going to give you just a couple examples. My first example is Miguel Mendez. He was born in Mexico and then grew up in Arizona. He is one of the most important authors who writes in kind of the Southwest from the US in Spanish. All of his works have been translated as well. But one of the things that that is so impactful about the way that he writes about the landscape and the land is that it's ancestral. And so that when he talks about the land, there are voices, speaking of haunting, that might have been erased or might not be heard in the mainstream media or histories, but that his characters and his narratives bring back. So this quote, and some of you might understand Spanish, es mañana cuando vaya saliendo el sol, del Cofín, en Cofín irán brotando las dunas, lomas de camellos cansados en la tarde, cuando vaya ocultando su muerte, las dunas multiplicarán su tumba. And so he talks about how dunes in the desert become moving and become alive and are kind of tombs of alive, but not alive, ghostly. Okay. The next one that I want to talk about is a play, and Virginia Hernandez is from Nayarit, but she lives in Ensenada. She's done her whole theater performance, her theater career in Ensenada and Tijuana. And she talks about landscape and as ritual. And she particularly talks about the space of the border and how the border santo is a saint that everyone goes and talks to when they are seeking consult of how to cross, or of where people have gone who have already crossed and they don't know where they are. And so her text is fascinating because it's not only the landscape and border as protagonist, but also as a ritual, and also as the spiritual guidance that we seek when there is unknown. And this is kind of a similar one in terms of ritual and presence. And this is one of my favorite short stories. It's called La Piedra del Río. And it talks about a woman who is kind of the sentinel of the river and the desert and the crossing. And people go and talk to her and ask where their loved ones have ended up and if they're still around. And so it talks about it's a very long story of many generations of many stories that are secret and held only by this woman, and the information that they seek is only held by her. And when she passes that's those stories and those histories to her adopted son. And this is the last quote of him, of a man, an older man who listens intently to the stories while he's resting against the stone on the river. And these are just a couple kind of art pictures of a little bit of our San Diego kind of Tijuana border area of like mixing in language and our rich diversity of linguistic abilities. And then I just want to say, when we're talking about the border and the frontier, we're talking about something that is a construct that we've imagined. And so I love this quote by Martin Luther King. He criticized this idea of the frontier and kind of border, saying that it feeds into lots of pathologies of racism and violent masculinity and a moralism that celebrates the rich and punishes the poor. And so I always think about this when we're talking about borders and landscapes and all sorts of desert narratives. And with that, I will pass over to Professor Silvia-Send.
Okay, Elisa, do you need to say anything, or should I just take it?
No, I mean, thank you, Dr. Petersen, but we can also go right along.
The title of my section of this panel is Law, Ecology, and Justice, but I've had to qualify the title by saying first that I'm not an ecologist, not a philosopher, not a historian, and I only teach law. But the Tijuana-San Diego border pollution issue is a combination of all those things, and I think it complements really nicely what both Professor Ford and Petersen just talked about. And I think we all have a kind of a general idea about how we think about ecology and justice in history. So I'm not going to go into those philosophical questions of those differences. But I've also qualified the title by asking justice for whom? Because law and justice do not always coincide, as you might imagine. And we've been talking about this since ancient times. We've asked whether justice is part of law or is it a value judgment? So I'm going to leave you with that, about that title. And a little bit about myself, which I didn't talk about earlier. I do teach in the School of Law, which means my classes are all graduate level. In fact, they're upper level classes within law. They're quite specialized. So my educational background is multidisciplinary. Originally, I was a scientist, a chemist. And then later I studied law, in particular international law. And secondly, I would say I'm multi-country because I was born in a small island nation called Sri Lanka, which you may know was colonized by the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. So I've gone through all those waves myself. It's also shown in my name. And then I grew up in Rome, in Italy, going to an international American and British school. I did my chemistry degree in England. I met my German husband there. I lived in Germany for about 16 years, did my doctorate there, and then we moved to California decades ago, which makes me how old? Like 100 years old. As a result of this background, though, I speak several languages and not just European ones, I have to say. And therefore, I'm kind of a supporter of international relations and international law. And I say kind of because I know that the law which governs nations, which is international law, is based on European dominance. And also it is heavily biased. In fact, I've written about that. But still, we need something in a globalized world today, even though I also recognize it's very difficult in implementation. So in the School of Law, I teach on topics that have to do with science and have a link with international. such as this cross-border pollution class on which I'm sort of basing my talk. I teach international environmental law, international energy, trade and investment, climate change law, nuclear energy law, etc. So what is the Tijuana-San Diego border pollution issue? Well, I've given you just 2 links here. And we're going to look only at the top one just for 2 minutes, because if you search for this on Google, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of similar videos, some biased, some less biased. You'll find documentaries, and we're going to just watch that top one. And feel free to look up whatever you want, get yourself informed. But below that is a very short list of excerpts from newspaper articles from the link that's at the bottom left. And what it shows you just is that these dates go back quite a way, right? So 1934, we already have a reference to the Tijuana River problem, sewage problem. 37, fast forward to 83, mayor is screaming mad about the sewage woes. We find in 1997, there's a wastewater treatment plant built, but in 1999, we have spillages across the border again. So let's just have a quick look at this little 2 minutes of this little link that I sent you. So it goes from about 6 minutes, about 1.5 minutes. Also has its, I could say, biases or errors. However, it gives you an idea. And as I said, you can go ahead and look at some more of these. So we do have to, again, consider the history. And I think you heard about this both from Professor Ford and Petersen. We have if you look on the bottom right here, this is called the Tijuana River Watershed. I remember talking about a watershed to some decision makers that we were trying to educate about climate change, and they asked if that's a shed where you store water. So I want to tell you that it is not a shed that stores water, but it is the whole of the area that fills the rivers and makes it flow into the ocean. So this whole area is the feeder of water to the Tijuana River, which actually is only called Tijuana River towards the end, because as you can see, rivers flow into it from the US side and from the Mexican side. Okay, so we have this whole area being populated by the Kumeyaay tribe. And as you saw in Professor Ford's slide, Europeans start trickling in from 1542 through the Catholic missions and also from military outposts under the expansion of the Spanish Empire. Father Junipero Serra establishes the first mission in San Diego in 1769, but eventually we have 29 missions in California with forced conversion of the natives, labor camps, disease, land dispossession, and all the things you've heard about. Mexico then declared independence from Spain in 1823 and kind of continued and used the system of rancheros to get settlers to come and stay basically in this southwest area. So in 1848, when Mexico lost to the US in that war, there was a treaty, so international law, Treaty of Hidalgo, 1848, which split the Californias into a US side and a Mexican side, which you heard a little about. It was a political boundary. As you can see, it's a straight line. That would mean it's political. And there was created an International Boundary Commission in 1889 to set up those markers, which you saw Professor Petersen showed you, actually, some of the markers along the border all across the United States. And then that became the International Boundary and Water Commission in 1944, also under international law, because guess what? There were rivers at the border as well, and we had to deal with how to deal with the water. Okay, so this just shows you how the question of justice for whom. So first of all, we have on the top left, the Kumeyaay lands when the Spanish landed in 1769. You can see here, the Tijuana River is right here. There is no US-Mexico border, and the Kumeyaay were, wandering all this area. They didn't have a concept of property rights as the European system eventually did and does. And then by 1798, you can see here the mission started, and the mission started expanding and expanding until in about 1822, there was maximum control of both the mission system and the Spanish control. The Kumeyaay lands had shrunk. And what we have on the right side here is what's left of the Kumeyaay lands, which is in the form of reservations. You see a lot more reservations up here in California than in Mexico. However, it's the same, it used to be the same people at some point. The boundary obviously was political and arbitrary. It didn't care about the rights of the people, of course not of the ecosystem. You can see here that because it's a river, and this is typical for any civilization, farmers will settle on both sides of a river bank because it's more fertile, right? And so the only thing was the Tijuana River only flowed during rainy seasons, but so the banks were fertile and they were settled by farmers on both sides. But every so often there were massive floods, like here, the one in 1889, 1916, 1927, basically washed everything out of the valley and the farms as well. So the farmers got together, both sides really, and proposed that there should be a Tijuana flood district. And this is typical. You'll see in Los Angeles that they've also done a lot of flood control. You don't see it in San Diego because of how things developed here. But this was put in the back on the back shelf for a while because during the liquor prohibition and horse racing bans in the 1920s in the US, we had thousands and thousands of tourists going over to Tijuana to be able to do just those things, which you couldn't do here. But anyway, in 1934, the Boundary Commission was asked to prepare a report on the sewage problem because we had tons and tons of tourists going and causing a lot of pollution. And in 1944, we had that treaty that I mentioned before, which talked about the distribution of water, how to control floods, but importantly, it also had some provisions on sewage control. So fast forward a little bit more, mid-1930s, just see Tijuana's resident population, not the tourists, was about 8,000. And typically they're serviced by a large septic tank and also just dump into the nearest river. This was common practice. It was nothing new or odd. That's what people did. In 1935, San Diego's population was a lot larger than Tijuana's. Common practice, septic tanks, dump the sewage into the bay. In fact, it was so bad that the Navy ships which were here were affected with corrosion. Realizing that they too were part of the problem, they started creating their own treatment and discharge systems. So got rid of that source. And the beaches of La Jolla and Pacific Beach were so bad, so contaminated, tourism was affected. And so gradually cities around San Diego Bay began to collect and treat their own waste. 1964, Mexico starts a border industrialization program to try to promote border employment and attract investment from outside. 1980, Tijuana's population 400, not even 500,000. San Diego's is still a whole lot more. And in 1994, the free trade agreement between Mexico and the US was signed and opened US markets, taking advantage of their very much lower labor costs, low overheads, closeness to US markets, which actually made it very successful for growth at the border. This growth came not only from Mexico, it came from further south and from everywhere else. Hillsides were stripped on the Mexican side to make way for what they call informal settlements. And then in 2000, the population in Tijuana went up to about 1.2 million. San Diego is about the same. And then last year it was 1.8 and San Diego was 1.4. So you can see that it was not just Tijuana that grew that fast, okay? It's only now that is different. So I take my students in my class to visit this estuary. So if you look from the east towards the ocean, here's Chile. You'll see here, this is Mexico. It's built up nearly all the way to the border. You notice it's higher than this side, which means everything flows this way naturally. And on this area, what we call Tijuana sloughs in the US. But if you look in the other direction, you can see how crowded it is along the Mexican border. And on the left-hand side, you see the US border with this estuary, what we call, and then this is the International Wastewater Treatment Plant. Basically, wastewater collected on the Mexico side are treated to a certain extent. It is not that it's not treated, but it doesn't capture all the housing because there's a lot of informal settlements. But what they do capture, they do treat according to the treaty, and they send it over here, send it to our treatment plant which cleans it up even more. It goes under the estuary, comes out at the ocean about 3 miles offshore. So it's cleaned up. If you go today and look from high up, you will see this difference again. On our side, we have this kind of natural, as close as possible, flow into the ocean. On the other side, you see this channelized system, which we also have in Los Angeles. Nothing new about that system of doing things. In fact, the US was supposed to do it on this side, but because of protest by environmentalists, it did not end up doing that. It kept it as an estuary. So although we built dams to control the floods on both sides, the US decided not to build this kind of concrete channel situation and opted instead to have this as a conservation area and as a wetland area. All right, so today, if we look at land ownership on the US side, so here's the border, that straight line. You can see all these different colors, right? So that means it's owned by somebody else, right? So you have California State Parks, you have the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, you have the US Navy doing practices there in that area, you have Department of Homeland Security, WAL, you have the County of San Diego because they are responsible for health, all in this area and for the whole county. We have parts of the land owned by the city of San Diego. We have a bit of Imperial Beach here, and that's where you get most of the news from because there's a lot of surfing going on, very good surfing there. And they're the ones who are first affected by this issue of sewage flowing. We have private lands that are mostly horse ranches, or there's also a campground. And this yellow line here outlines this sort of protected area. Okay. And then these yellow stars show you, because Tijuana is higher than San Diego, this is where stuff, when it rains, or now when it doesn't rain, informal settlements that are not connected to the sewer system will just flow down through this Goat Canyon, through the Yogurt Canyon, through Smuggler's Gulch, and some other places, and they will completely miss this treatment area. So when we have floods, this will flood. They've got to close this because it's too much. And all these will overflow from the other side. So that's why we have the situation. How does it look on the Tijuana side? Guess what? It looks worse, right? So for Tijuanans or Mexican NGOs that I often work with, they say, hey, what are you complaining about? It's really bad on our side. Because guess what? We have formal housing, which is not connected to the sewer. We have informal housing, not connected to the sewer. There are lots of sources along the coast here that just goes into it. The beaches are really bad. The beaches of Baja California, they say, the worst, the most contaminated in Mexico. According to the NGOs, they say this sign is hardly visible, so you get people using it anyway and probably get sick, just like they do here. Except that here we're more careful with all the signs and make sure people know. And in addition, because of all this sort of, I would say the way they construct things, 64% of the coastline is subject to erosion, much less in the US. But we had done that already beforehand. So we have a lot of differences today across the border. We've got economic asymmetry. Minimum wages are usually 10 to 1, but we're sort of catching up along the border. The minimum wage, not the average. Minimum wage is nearly the same along the border trade zones. There are some trade zones, but the GDP per capita, that means what we earn divided by every single person, the population. In Mexico, it's 14,000. In the US, it's 89,000. That's a huge difference. That's an incentive for people to come, right? Municipal budgets there are very low compared to here. Mexico has a different system. It's highly centralized. In fact, Mexico City, sort of like DC, right? It's very far away from us, from Tijuana. It's very hard to get their attention. And the budgets have to flow from federal to state to local. There is a lot of turnover at the local level of administration, and the regulation is very different among each of those different levels of government, and border governance is weak. Both sides have complicated public administration, but in the US, there's a lot of local control and very active NGOs, not so much on the US side. Despite all these differences, we have a huge Cali-Baja regional economy. Despite that straight line border, despite everything else, we have a lot of trade and investment. And of course, it's complemented by the pollution on the right-hand side. So we not only have pollution from the municipalities, which have aging or lacking infrastructure on the Mexican side, we also have industrial waste. Guess why? Partly because of the establishment of this system of these factories, these maquiladoras along the border. These are multinational companies, some US companies. We've got tires. I want to tell you a tiny bit about tires in the next slide, or just tell you about that in a sec. We have medical waste. Do you know people who go across Tijuana for medical services? I do. And why? Because it's a lot cheaper. Do you know people who live on the other side of the border in housing, which may or may not be permitted according to standard? I do, because it's cheaper on the other side of the border. So we've got residential sewage, which is not being collected, and we have a whole scourge of plastic. Okay, so we've got both things. We've got the good and the bad. In addition today, so that's the land-based sources of pollution. Here's the old river, right? Here's a treatment, a little bit of treatment on Mexico. It's supposed to go in here, and get treated further at the international treatment plant, which goes offshore. But as I said, there are all these places where things leak. And there's another area and lots of areas around here with informal housing, even further south. A treatment plant in Mexico, which hasn't worked for decades, it now does. That means that at some times of the year, we have a lot of sewage, untreated sewage, bacterial, viral contamination coming north. Not always, sometimes, depending on the ocean currents. Now, as a lawyer, finally getting to my area, how do we deal with this? And this is exactly why I started the class, because I wanted people to realize this is a very, very complicated situation. A lawyer would advise, advocate, represent their client and their client's rights based on some kind of distillation of the law. So we need to know, what is the law? Who's the client? Is it the people affected by surfing? Is it the farmers? Is it the Mexicans who have no homes? I mean, who is the client? What are their rights? Have the rights been harmed? Whose fault is it? I mean, lawyers, on our side especially, always try to pin the blame on someone else so that they can be made liable to pay for any damage. Looking for someone to sue, and who will pay. Right? But it's very, very difficult to answer any of these questions in this context. Do we have domestic law that deals with it? Yes, we do have US and Mexican domestic law related to water quality. We have permits that on our side are heavily enforced. In Mexico, they have similar, but implementation is weak and enforcement is very difficult. Do we have litigation? Yes, in the United States, we have many lawsuits that have occurred over the decades under the Clean Water Act. And we have hundreds of litigants, okay? That means we have the money to do this. Mexico, not so much. We have very few litigants. For one thing, they're a little bit afraid because they might be intimidated by drug people, by the developers who don't want to get permits, by corruption. So they're trying now to do a lot more education on human rights over in Mexico. So then we have to turn, guess what, to international law. How can we deal with this between the countries? Yes, there is a treaty. And yes, there are lots of mini agreements under this treaty over the decades. And actually, it is quite successful. Related to the sewage, we had several, but I've only pointed out 1990, the mini agreement called a MINIT, with the construction of that international treatment plant. We had another one that talked much more about binational cooperation on the issues. So there's a binational working group. You can take part in it if you want to. In the latest MINIT a few years ago, they decided on the US side that they were going to expand that treatment plant to catch more of the waste coming from Mexico. We have another international treaty. It's called the USMCA. This came after NAFTA, which is a free trade agreement, which led to the development of the whole factory area and the free trade zone in Mexico. And actually money has come. I mean, I still hope it will come in this administration too, to expand the treatment plant, double its capacity and build kind of new treatment facilities and kind of direct the canyon flows to this expanded thing so that the beaches don't get so messed up. It's expected to reduce transboundary flow a lot during the summer and still a lot during wet weather. So the treaties are doing something. And so I think what I'm going to do is think about all these things you've heard from all three of us, really. And what I can tell you is that domestic law does help, but it helps some people, right? It helps people in the US because there's money to pressurize the governments, the cities to do more. International law also helps, but it's very, very slow. And the other question I have to ask is, what about justice to those who are not helped? What about the ecosystem? We know that there's a lot of contaminated sediment in the estuary on our side, but we haven't even gone there. It's just too much. And then there are many, many complicating factors so that you cannot really answer the question of whose fault is it? When students come to my class first, they say, let's sue the hell out of Mexico. That's a typical reaction. You'll hear politicians say that. Okay, if you do that, what's gonna, there's a lot of trade, new goods, used goods. And I was telling you about tires. Well, California itself produces about 60 million waste tires a year, and about 1 million, at least 1 million that we know about end up in Baja, and they come back to us. So what we send out seems to come back to us as waste. Okay, and you saw though in Professor Petersen's slides that these tires can be used to landscape. So Mexicans do that, whether it's for landscaping artistically or poor people using it as a fence, apart from it coming back to us in the form of waste. We have a lot of labor movement. We have a lot of health and housing movement by US citizens. So whose fault is it? Is a very difficult question to answer internationally, right? There are other international options. You can have mediation and then other soft mechanisms, which are successful, but again, they take a long time. That's why I educate the students who come my way about these other options too. And so I go back to the first slide, which was, law and ecology. And I asked, justice for who? And I have kind of changed the titles, law and ecology, striving for justice very slowly. It's a very slow process. And if you have questions, we can talk about it a lot more on, I think I'm on Thursday, right? So happy to talk to you. I don't know when or if I will ever see you because law is a post-bachelor degree. And mine are upper level within that, but I'll be happy to see you and welcome you and want to chat about this situation. Happy to do that. Thank you.
But yeah, I just want to conclude and say thank you to you all. This has been a wonderful group of students. We had a lot of engagement last week. I see the same enthusiasm this week. Again, as Professor Ford said, the critical thinking is at an all-time high. So it's really cool to see from all of you incoming first years. And I want to just extend a great thank you to our panelists, Professors Ford, Petersen, Silvia-Send. Begin thinking about the sort of different approaches to this topic, environmental justice, and you can discuss more in your sections and get that one-on-one kind of more USD experience with our experts. So I want to thank you all. If you have questions, just send me an email. But yeah, I'm wishing you all a great afternoon, evening, early morning. I know some of you are abroad. And so we will see you next Monday. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.